Hi there, my name is James, and welcome to our True Crime channel. Today, we're diving into a story filled with secrets, betrayal, and a twisted family dynamic. Stick around as we uncover the shocking truth behind the stepfather's shadow and how one young woman exposed the lies that tore her family apart. On August 15th, 2022, at exactly 8:15 a.m., 18-year-old Sophie Daniels returned home to what she expected would be a normal day, but nothing could have prepared her for what she would find. Her stepfather's office door, usually locked, stood slightly open. Curious, Sophie stepped inside. Papers were scattered across the desk, but one folder caught her eye. She opened it, her heart pounding. What she uncovered would unravel everything she thought she knew about her family. The perfect life she had once believed in began to crumble. Before the sudden shift in her life, Sophie had lived quietly in the small town of Larkspur, California. She was a reserved, thoughtful girl, creative and artistic. Her father had passed away when she was just 12, and since then, it had only been Sophie and her mother, Linda Daniels. For 6 years, they had lived in peace, with a routine that felt safe and familiar. Linda had worked tirelessly to provide for them, but Sophie could always see the loneliness in her mother's eyes. That all changed when Linda met Michael Pierce. He was everything Linda had hoped for, handsome, charming, and successful. Michael swept Linda off her feet, bringing a sense of stability and care she hadn't felt since Sophie's father died. He was well liked in town and admired for his generosity and presence. But Sophie felt something unsettling about him, even if she couldn't put her finger on it. There was a distance in his eyes, a sense that not everything was as it seemed. Sophie's mother, Linda, was completely taken by Michael. She believed he was the answer to her prayers, providing the companionship she had longed for. Linda, once cautious, began trusting Michael with every aspect of their lives. She adored him and believed he could do no wrong. For Sophie, though, things felt different. Michael had a son from a previous relationship, Ethan Pierce, 20 years old, and already carrying the weight of an adult's burdens. He had recently dropped out of college and seemed lost, much like Sophie. Ethan was quiet, mysterious, and a little withdrawn, but there was something about him that drew Sophie in. Over time, they grew close, sharing their thoughts and feelings late into the night in their family's backyard. He opened up about his own struggles, feeling disconnected from his father's new life. Sophie, too, felt isolated. Her mother was consumed by her new relationship with Michael, and Sophie was left to navigate this strange new reality alone. Ethan became her escape. The bond they shared soon blossomed into something deeper, something Sophie had never expected. As they spent more time together, Sophie found herself falling for him. But with every new day, her growing feelings for Ethan brought with them a sense of unease. There were things Ethan wouldn't talk about, questions about his past that he always seemed to avoid. And as their relationship deepened, Sophie began noticing unsettling details about her new stepbrother and her stepfather. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. As she delved into Ethan's background, Sophie realized that his life story wasn't adding up. The more she learned, the more confused she became. Ethan seemed to have a complicated relationship with his father, but whenever Sophie asked about it, he would change the subject. Then, one evening, she stumbled across a vague mention of a lawsuit involving her stepfather's former business partner, who had mysteriously vanished after a scandal. That scandal seemed to echo in Ethan's shadowy past, and Sophie's suspicions grew. It was all too strange to be a coincidence. The closer she got to Ethan, the more distant he seemed. His late-night phone calls, his unexplained absences, all of it pointed to something bigger, something Sophie couldn't yet see, but felt in her bones. What had started as a romantic connection was now turning into a web of secrets, lies, and hidden truths. The discovery she made on August 15th was just the beginning. The documents she found in her stepfather's office hinted at something dark, something that connected Ethan to Michael in ways Sophie couldn't have imagined. The life she thought she knew was unraveling. And the deeper she went, the more dangerous the truth seemed to become. Sophie didn't know it then, but she was about to uncover the darkest secret her family had ever buried. Sophie's life was already shifting beneath her feet, but it was her growing relationship with Ethan that threw everything into chaos. What started as a bond between two lonely souls slowly became something deeper. Ethan, though reserved, shared his thoughts with Sophie during quiet conversations in the backyard under the stars. He was different from anyone she had known, quiet, but with a hint of darkness that intrigued her. They both felt displaced in this new family dynamic, each caught between their parents' expectations and their own uncertainties. At first, the relationship felt natural, even comforting. Sophie had someone to talk to, someone who seemed to understand her confusion and isolation. But as they spent more time together, Sophie started to notice subtle inconsistencies. Ethan would dodge certain questions, particularly those about his past and his relationship with his father, Michael. It was as if there were pieces of Ethan's life he didn't want her to know, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that his presence in her life wasn't entirely by chance. By late August, things were getting stranger. Sophie stumbled upon small clues that something wasn't right. One evening, she noticed Ethan sneaking out of the house to make a phone call. The conversation, muffled by distance, sounded tense. Sophie couldn't hear much, but the way Ethan spoke, hushed and hurried, left her feeling unsettled. When she asked him later, Ethan brushed it off, claiming it was just an old friend. But Sophie wasn't convinced. There was something in his eyes, a look that said there was more to the story than he was letting on. It wasn't just the phone calls. Ethan seemed to be growing more distant, emotionally pulling away just as they were getting closer. He became evasive, offering vague explanations for his late nights and cryptic phone conversations. Sophie tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the connection they had, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. Every time she thought about Ethan's life before moving in with her family, she felt like there was a part of him he was keeping hidden. The turning point came on August 25th, 2022. Sophie was in the hallway, heading toward the kitchen, when she overheard a heated conversation between Michael and Ethan behind the closed door of Michael's office. Their voices were low but intense. Sophie paused, her heart racing as she listened to fragments of the argument. She heard Michael say, "You're in too deep now," and Ethan responded, "It's too late to back out." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sophie's stomach turned. What could they be talking about? What was Ethan involved in that made her stepfather so agitated? She wanted to confront them, to burst through the door and demand answers, but fear held her back. Instead, she retreated to her room, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. What could Ethan have done that was so serious? Why was Michael so involved? From that moment, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about what she'd overheard. The tension between Ethan and Michael grew, and Sophie began to see her stepfather in a new light. The charm he had shown her mother, the stability he offered, now felt like a facade, hiding something much darker underneath. And then there was Ethan. The more Sophie thought about it, the more she realized that his arrival in her life wasn't just a coincidence. There was something linking him to Michael, something Sophie didn't yet understand but was determined to uncover. Unable to ignore the mounting evidence, Sophie began digging into Michael's past. She searched through old news articles and business records, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had overheard. What she found wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying. Years earlier, Michael had been involved in a major business scandal. His former partner, David Matthews, had disappeared under suspicious circumstances after a legal dispute over fraud. The case had never been solved, and the connection between Michael and David was buried deep in the past. But what caught Sophie's attention was something else. Ethan's last name wasn't Pierce. It was Matthews. Ethan was David's son. Everything suddenly clicked into place. Ethan hadn't come into her life by accident. He had been placed there, possibly as a pawn in some twisted game of revenge between Michael and his former partner. But why? What role was Ethan playing? Was he being manipulated by Michael, or was he working with him? Sophie's mind was spinning, her thoughts a tangled web of possibilities. The Ethan she thought she knew was slipping away, replaced by a stranger with motives she couldn't yet understand. Despite the shock of her discovery, Sophie couldn't bring herself to confront Ethan, not yet. Instead, she quietly continued her investigation, growing more anxious with every passing day. The connection between Michael and Ethan felt too dangerous to ignore, but Sophie needed more proof. She began looking for patterns, paying closer attention to Ethan's behavior and Michael's interactions with him. The tension in the house was palpable. Even Linda, usually oblivious to the undercurrents in her family, sensed something was wrong. Then, in early September, Sophie stumbled upon another clue, one that shook her to the core. It was a document tucked away in the back of her stepfather's desk, detailing the terms of a financial agreement between Michael and Ethan. The document was cryptic, but it mentioned payments, something about settling the debt. Sophie's heart raced as she realized what it meant. Michael had been paying Ethan, possibly to keep quiet about the past or to ensure his cooperation in whatever scheme they were running. But what was the end game? What were they trying to achieve? Sophie felt trapped. The people closest to her were hiding secrets that could destroy her family. She didn't know whom to trust, certainly not Michael, and now not even Ethan. The boy she had grown to love was part of something far bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Every instinct told her to run, to tell her mother what she had found, but Sophie hesitated. She needed to understand the full picture before she made her move. The relationship between Sophie and Ethan, once built on mutual understanding and affection, had now turned into a minefield of lies and manipulation. Ethan, once her escape from the chaos, was now part of the storm. Sophie was left questioning everything, his intentions, his feelings for her, and whether he was a victim like her or the orchestrator of the deception. By mid-September, Sophie could no longer keep quiet. The burden of what she had discovered was too heavy to carry alone. She confronted Ethan late one night. The backyard where they had once shared so many secrets was now the stage for a bitter reckoning. Her voice trembled as she demanded the truth. "Was any of it real, Ethan? Or was I just part of your father's plan?" Ethan, for once, didn't have an answer. His silence was more damning than anything he could have said. Sophie's world was unraveling, and she knew the time for waiting was over. She had to act before it was too late. Sophie's heart was pounding as she stepped back from Ethan, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. The person she had trusted, the one who had been her comfort in the chaos, had now become part of the tangled mess that surrounded her. But what terrified her the most was the possibility that Ethan had been playing a role this entire time. She couldn't wait any longer. Sophie went to her room and gathered every piece of evidence she had collected. The documents from Michael's office, the mysterious phone calls, the legal papers she had discovered linking Ethan to David Matthews. She was certain now. Ethan wasn't who he claimed to be. He wasn't just her stepbrother. He was the son of the man who had disappeared after crossing Michael years earlier. And somehow, he had been brought into her life as part of Michael's plan. But was Ethan just a pawn, or was he playing his own game? On September 12th, 2022, Sophie made her decision. She couldn't let this continue. She took her evidence to the Larkspur Police Department and met with Detective James Holton, a seasoned investigator known for his tenacity and sharp instincts. Sitting in the sterile police station, Sophie told him everything. About her mother's sudden remarriage to Michael Pierce, Ethan's strange behavior, and the trail of documents that linked Ethan to a dark chapter in Michael's past. Detective Holton listened carefully, taking notes as Sophie laid out the twisted web she had uncovered. His expression remained neutral, but Sophie could tell he was intrigued. After she finished speaking, Holton asked a few questions, pressing for details on the financial records she had found. The link between Michael and Ethan and Michael's shady business dealings clearly piqued his interest. "We'll need to verify everything, but this is significant," Holton said, looking directly at Sophie. "If what you're saying is true, this could be part of a much larger scheme." As Sophie left the station, she felt a mix of relief and fear. She had done the right thing by coming forward, but now the investigation was in motion, and she had no idea how far it would go, or how dangerous it would become. By September 15th, 2022, the investigation was in full swing. Detective Holton and his team began looking into Michael's financial history, and it didn't take long for them to uncover evidence of fraudulent transactions and offshore accounts. Michael had been hiding millions, funneling money into secret accounts under fake names. Ethan, it seemed, had been part of the plan to keep those secrets buried. The documents Sophie had found in Michael's office were key. They showed payments made to Ethan over the past year, payments that could only mean one thing. Ethan had been working for Michael, helping him cover up his crimes. The more the investigators dug, the more they uncovered. It wasn't just about Ethan's father, David Matthews, anymore. This was about years of financial manipulation and fraud, with Michael using his new family as a shield to hide his illicit activities. Sophie's mind reeled. The boy she had fallen in love with was more deeply involved than she ever could have imagined. And yet, there was still a part of her that wondered, was Ethan a victim too? Was he coerced by Michael, forced to play a role in a scheme he didn't want to be part of? Or had Ethan willingly gone along with the plan, using Sophie and her mother to secure his own future? That question haunted her, even as the investigation moved forward. Then, on the evening of September 18th, 2022, Sophie overheard another conversation, this time between her mother and Michael. It was late, well after midnight, and Sophie had gone downstairs to get a glass of water. As she passed the living room, she heard her mother's voice, strained and full of disbelief. "How could you do this, Michael?" Linda asked, her voice cracking. "I trusted you. I thought you loved us." Sophie froze. She couldn't see them, but she could hear every word. Michael's response was cold and calculated. "You don't understand, Linda. This was never about love. It was about survival. Ethan and I needed a way to fix what had been broken, and you were part of that solution." Linda's sobs echoed through the house. Sophie felt her entire body go numb. Her mother, the woman who had believed in Michael's charm and care, was now seeing the truth. But Michael's next words sent a chill down Sophie's spine. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Michael hissed. "If you leave, if you try to expose any of this, I'll make sure you regret it. You and Sophie will both be ruined." Sophie's heart raced. She couldn't let Michael hurt her mother, and she couldn't let him destroy what was left of their lives. She rushed back upstairs, her mind made up. It was time to end this. On September 20th, 2022, with enough evidence in hand, Detective Holton moved forward with the arrest. The scene was tense. Michael Pierce was taken into custody at his office, his face twisted in anger as the police led him away in handcuffs. The charges were serious: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. And there was still the question of Ethan's involvement. Ethan, for his part, had disappeared. Sophie hadn't seen or heard from him in days. But Detective Holton assured her they were tracking his movements. He wouldn't be able to hide for long. As Michael's trial loomed, Sophie found herself caught in the aftermath of her discovery. Her mother was shattered, their once perfect life now exposed as a lie. And Ethan, the boy she had once loved, was gone, leaving Sophie to question whether any of it had been real. With Michael Pierce in custody, the investigation shifted toward Ethan. Sophie's emotions were torn between the sense of relief that her stepfather was finally being held accountable and the deep sense of betrayal from Ethan's disappearance. She couldn't help but wonder where he had gone. Was he running from the truth, or had he been forced into hiding by the same man who had orchestrated so many of the lies that shattered their family? Detective Holton pressed on with the case, digging through financial records and linking Michael to years of fraud and deceit. But the bigger question now was Ethan. On September 23, 2022, the authorities tracked Ethan's location to a small town just outside of San Francisco, where he had been hiding since Michael's arrest. They found him staying at a cheap motel, alone and disheveled. When the police brought him in for questioning, it was clear that Ethan was no longer the same person Sophie had grown close to. Ethan confessed during interrogation that he had been pulled into his father's world when he was a teenager, long before Sophie or her mother had entered their lives. At first, Ethan had resisted, wanting nothing to do with Michael's shady business dealings. But over time, as Michael's control tightened and the threats escalated, Ethan felt trapped. He had no choice but to follow through with his father's demands, even if it meant betraying the only person who had shown him genuine care. Sophie. Sophie heard about Ethan's confession through Detective Holton. As much as it hurt, she understood the depth of his involvement. He hadn't been an innocent bystander, but he wasn't the mastermind either. He had been a pawn, manipulated by his father's greed and power. Holton informed Sophie that Ethan had agreed to cooperate with the investigation, offering up key details about Michael's fraudulent activities in exchange for a reduced sentence. By early October 2022, Ethan had been officially charged as an accomplice to Michael's crimes, but was given leniency due to his cooperation. Michael, on the other hand, faced a far harsher fate. His trial would take place in the coming months, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had used his family as a shield, manipulating not only the people around him, but also the foundation of trust and love that Sophie and her mother had built over the years. Linda Daniels, devastated by the betrayal, struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The man she had loved and trusted was a stranger, someone who had used her vulnerability for his own gain. But amidst the heartache, she found strength in Sophie. Together, they began to rebuild their lives, though the scars of Michael's deception would never fully fade. The town of Larkspur, once oblivious to the secrets hidden behind the Pierce family's facade, was left in shock. Local news outlets covered every detail of the case, and the media frenzy only deepened the sense of loss and betrayal Sophie and her mother felt. But Sophie knew that the worst was over. She had faced the darkness head-on and had come out the other side, stronger and more determined to protect herself and her mother from any future harm. On October 10th, 2022, Sophie stood outside the courthouse, watching as Michael Pierce was led away in handcuffs once again, this time to face his trial. Ethan had already been sentenced to a lesser term in prison, and though Sophie's heart ached for him, she knew that his choices had led him down that path. There was no turning back for any of them now. Sophie and her mother moved away from Larkspur shortly after the trial. The shadow of Michael Pierce no longer hung over them, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. But Sophie had learned to trust herself, and that was the first step toward healing. The chapter of her life marked by deceit and betrayal was closing, but a new one was just beginning. On October 20th, 2022, Michael Pierce was found guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, and the weight of his crimes finally caught up with him. His sentence was harsh, marking the end of his ability to manipulate those around him. Ethan, on the other hand, had already begun serving his time. His cooperation with the investigation granted him leniency, but the consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. For Sophie, the trial's conclusion was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the emotional scars were deep. The betrayal by both her stepfather and Ethan forever changed her perception of trust and love. Her relationship with her mother, though strained by the weight of the past, had grown stronger in the aftermath. Together, they had faced the darkest parts of their lives and had come out more resilient. Sophie and Linda left Larkspur behind, seeking a fresh start in a new town. It wasn't easy to rebuild, but they carried with them the strength they had gained through the pain. As time passed, the memories of Michael and Ethan faded, but the lessons remained clear. Trust must be earned, and sometimes the people closest to you can cause the deepest wounds. Sophie knew her journey wasn't over, but she had learned how to navigate the shadows left behind by her stepfather's deceit. Moving forward, she was determined to live on her own terms, free from the lies that once consumed her family. Some secrets once uncovered can never be buried again. This is the story of Sophie Daniels, the girl who uncovered her family's darkest secret and found the strength to escape the shadow of her stepfather. And that's the story of Asterisk, the stepfather's shadow Asterisk. What would you have done in Sophie's shoes? Do you think Ethan was a victim or just as guilty as his father? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another true crime story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.